Okay, so this next mechanic is going to be a lot shorter since it's going to be similar to this bounce volume. But basically, we want to put together a jump pad. So this would be a triggered area where when the player enters, it will apply a vertical upward force onto the player. And really what we want to do is we want to set the player's velocity just to shoot upwards whenever it hits the jump pad. And since this isn't really based off of real physics, we're just going to set the velocity directly. So I can show you how to do that versus adding the force, which we were doing previously. Okay, so let's put this together. I'm going to, let's build a new object. Let's just make this one a cube. Maybe I'll resize this a little bit, stretch it down, stretch it out a little bit. We'll say 0.5, 2. Let's make that like 0.3. Okay. Bring that down just a little bit. Okay, we'll put that over here. Make a new material for it. All right, I'm working off of that. I'm going to make a new material called m_JumpPad. All right, let's make this one green. Apply that. All right, so this cube, I'm gonna rename this jump pad. And don't forget, we do want this to be a trigger. If this were a collision, it would be a wall that stopped us. We want to roll through it, but when the two colliders intersect, we want to apply our script. So I'm just gonna make sure that this is a trigger by clicking the is trigger on the box collider, right? So a wall is a collider, this is a trigger. Additionally, our jump pad is going to be pretty similar to our bounce script, but I'm going to make a new script. Call this jump pad. Go. All right. Double click to open that up. And I'm also going to apply this script to the jump pad, right? Because we want the functionality on this game object. And finally, in general, copy pasting code is not ideal practice inside of programming. But since we're not going to get into advanced concepts for now, the best way to do this would be to have the jump pad inherit from the bumper and then change the things that we want to change, like only change the part where it applies the force and do that differently. But for now, I'm just going to keep this simple. I'm going to copy this. Maybe we have a little bit more control this way. And paste it into here. So jump pad. Really the big difference, I want the detection, right? I want to detect if it's the player, if it enters the trigger. I do want to get the rigid body. I want to double check to make sure that the rigid body has something in it. This is around the point where I want to do something different. And the first thing I want to do, this part up top where it says bounce amount, that's fine. Let's call this, I don't want to call this, let's call this upward force. So if you double click, you right click and you rename, if you're inside of Visual Studio, if you're using Mono Develop, it might not have this, but if you're inside of Visual Studio, just right click and do rename, and it will rename all, and then whatever you type in here, let's say upward bounce. You type that in and hit enter, you'll see it will change all the other instances of that variable. So if you wanted to change the name of player rigid body, for example, you could right click, rename that and do that. Just a really handy way of quickly changing variable names. One side note though, it's a little bit more complicated to change the name of a class. You also have to change the name of your script as well. And so I don't recommend doing that, but until you learn a little bit more, but that's a quick way to rename variables. This is the part that I want to change though. So I'm going to back up right there. So we know at this point that we have access to our player rigid body. Let's pseudocode this. What we want to do is apply a vertical velocity to the player. And the reason this isn't just a force is because a force would, we'd have to we're adding an additional force to the other forces that are already in effect on our object. So for example, for falling, we may be using gravity as one of those forces, right? And we want to be able to fall down onto the jump volume, but we just want this jump volume to be very consistent. So instead of adding forces to this, I'm just going to set the velocity and have the velocity set to moving straight vertical instantaneously. So to do that, we have our player rigid body, and we can access the velocity, and we can actually change that. The only trick to this is if in order to change the velocity, we have to give it a new velocity. And a velocity is an XYZ value, which you may remember is also considered a vector 3. This is just weird syntax stuff, but just know that if you want to change the velocity, you have to create a new vector 3, and then you give it an XYZ value, right? So if you wanted to if you wanted to replace the velocity with an upward force, this is the Y value, so you go X, Y. If I were to put 10 in there, it would shoot vertical. Or if I just wanted, for some reason, to make it shoot a particular forward direction, you put it here. And furthermore, we know that we want this to be vertical, but we want to tie it to our variable because this is going to change. This instance of it could be 10, and the next one could be 20. The next, we can change it for each particular one in our scene. But all I'm doing here is I'm saying 0, then our value Y, and then 0. So only move it in upward direction. So it's going to cancel all the other previous velocities. And so if we were moving forward when we hit it, it's just going to bounce it upwards. It's no longer going to be moving forward because we're changing it. And also, just as a side note, I'm going to change this default to be a little bit lower. By the way, this is the default. This is not the actual value that gets handled in script. When you open it up to the inspector, you are telling it override this value with whatever's in the inspector. But this is the starting point. Once you compile and you create this variable for the first time, this is the first number that's going to pop up in there, and then you can change it from there. I do this, and I click on the JumpPad and turn this back down to 10. So we have our bounce volume, or our bumper, and then we have our JumpPad. So I think this should work. Just the only thing to be aware of, right? So we have a little bounce. The only thing to be aware of is because we added this max volume, or this max speed to our player. I can find it right here. Because we're enforcing our max speed, that's why sometimes this bumper right here, if you try to turn this value too high, like even 300 might be too high, when it bounces, you might see a little bit of a camera pop there. That's because it's trying to manually slow down the velocity to be below 10. So just know that that's intended, and that's fine. But you may be limited in what you can do with your bounce volume here because we're capping the velocity. So we can try to make this more and see what happens. Yeah, you see, it's gonna cap it at around 10 anyway. So that's just a limitation. You can turn up this max speed if you want, and that would solve the problem. But just be aware of that. If you have any jump volumes and you're unsure of why you can't get it to move past a certain height, it's because of the max speed that we set on the player earlier. Okay, so these are our two force mechanics. Try and get those functional, and then we will build on top of that.